Eyes of a Woman by Robert Shuttleworth. Long ago, 1970 to be precise, I found myself fully 19 years of age, traveling alone between Iran and the west of Afghanistan. It was a cold and extremely wet November, and, as fate would have it, it was the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, a time at which men, women, and children are not permitted to eat or drink during daylight hours, and, as could be expected, the mood of the local people, while hospitable, was not full of levity. Hunger, cold torrents of rain, and mud do not make for much fun. For months I had been a solitary Canadian male traveller, heading overland in the direction of India, and in doing so had availed myself to every mode of transportation, including a Land Rover with one wheel the wrong size, and even a camel for a short time. Wet, sore feet were my constant companion. The most common device for moving people in the region was by truck, cleverly fitted out to give the appearance of a bus, complete with wooden benches and half windows of thin, breakable window glass. Eastern Iran and Afghanistan had been suffering a series of flash floods, and the roads were washed out, and travelers stranded on mushy mounds of mud, waiting for help that seldom arrived. On 4 occasions I found myself knee-deep in icy water, wading across rivers so that the bus may tear across these torrents, unencumbered by the weight of their expendable human cargo. When a bus successfully made it to the other side, the waiting passengers gave a round of applause and excited hurrahs, and all clambered back onto the vehicle to continue their journey. It was at one of these washouts that I saw 2 men swept away in a raging torrent, heroically attempting to get a tow rope from the bumper of one bus to the bumper of another on the opposite riverbank. This was serious traveling. Of course I had slept badly for many nights. The previous night I had attempted sleep under a table on a dirt floor in what might loosely be called a tea house. On another, I, along with other foreigners from imperiled buses, found ourselves in a village without any place for travelers to sleep, but were offered accommodation at the local military police station. We were escorted to a vast, gloomy room, which in fact was a dungeon, with a vaulted ceiling, like in a cheesy Hollywood film, complete with chains dangling from the wall, which were, fortunately, not in use at the time. This vast dark chamber was lit by one tiny bare light bulb that would have suitably illuminated a refrigerator, I think. There were about 16 of us, all bedding down on the floor, when the commandant of the station strode in with a very dignified air, wearing a white bathrobe. A soldier escorting him unfurled a sheep's hide in the middle of the room, placing it with great showmanship and elegance on the dirt floor. The commandant, in the bathrobe, sat down, crossing his legs with great style and dignity. With 2 claps of his hands, 2 uniformed soldiers entered the room, carrying an enormous tray of food and a large brass samovar of steaming hot tea. There was a large bowl of yogurt and pita and some local greens. For some reason it was delicious, and we fell on it like animals. The commandant looked amused and sat watchfully as if holding court. We were a ragtag group of strangers, Brits, Germans, Dutch, and French hippies, and a pair of Italian young men, always whispering and laughing, all brought together in an Afghan dungeon by the hospitality of this commandant and his men. The real reason for their hospitality was that they just didn't want us sleeping out in the village, and this is the only thing they could do to keep us off the streets and out of the mouths of dogs. Presently the commandant clapped his hands again, and his men carried out what was left of the food and tea. He stood up, looked us over, bowed slightly, and left the room. For some reason we started to applaud to show our thanks for this gesture of goodwill. Immediately the Italian started laughing and pulled out a piece of newspaper and started to roll an enormous joint. Some of the travelers pitched in with some of their own hash and grass, making it a team effort. It seemed as big as a torch. God knows it lit up the room when a match was put to it. The monster joint was passed to me, but I declined to smoke because I thought, here I was in a military police dungeon and smoking dope and with armed guards all around us. Somehow it just didn't make sense to me. I suffered terrible paranoia, and certainly didn't want to make it worse by inhaling this tempting intoxicant. A day later the rain tapered off, and we all resumed our travels, finding our respective buses. Afghanistan at the time was very much like the Wild West of America. Although there were very few Western strangers doing the grand tour to a freshly minted Beatle-era India, most were Afghan men in the bus, festooned with turbans and beards, wrapped in swathes of cloth, finished off with thick grey blankets tossed smartly over the shoulder. Nearly all of them carried a rifle, as well as very sinister-looking knives. There was something odd, though. Almost without exception, these unbelievably fierce-looking men would, in moments of boredom, magically produce little mirrors and tweezers from under their clothing, and proceed to meticulously pluck their nose hairs as we bounced along the rut-filled roads. They frequently held the mirror away to admire their efforts, and when satisfied, carefully tucked their grooming devices under their blankets. No one was unkind, but I did get a vast number of dirty looks when I thoughtlessly peeled a tangerine, whose magical scent instantly permeated the entire length of the bus, entering every freshly plucked nostril of these hungry people. A brisk and universally understood hand gesture was displayed indelicately, suggesting that it would be best if I put the pungent food away. I sheepishly complied. On occasion, the vehicle would stop, and everyone would pile out, toss their blankets down on any available dry spot, and begin to pray. The few Western travelers would, at these times, discreetly head to the other side of the bus and relieve themselves or sneak a bite of bread as required. Now it happened that there was a woman, a lone woman, traveling on the bus, and of course I became fascinated with her. She was covered from head to toe in dark grey, save and except for a slit about her eyes. She never seemed to look out the window or at her fellow passengers, and out of respect she was allowed a wooden bench all to herself. I didn't know if there was a man travelling with her or sitting elsewhere, a father, a brother, or even a husband. We never made real eye contact, but I did see hers twice, and oh, what eyes! Enormous, green, liquid, almond-shaped eyes, looking straight ahead at all times, unfortunately. I think our eyes must have met once for a fraction of a moment, and then passed. She moved with a fluid grace as she alighted from the bus, and with practised precision dodged the mud and puddles. Her skill in this regard may have been genetic, I don't know. Earlier in the day, our party had made an extended stop in the southern city of Kandahar, and I observed her disappearing into a shop in the bazaar. I had wished to tag along to see how a woman in this part of the world conducts herself alone in a strange city, but that was not to be. Moments after stepping off the bus, I was surrounded by school children, determined to have a look at this strange foreigner deposited in their midst. As it was the Beatle era, and long hair being very much in vogue, and I being a contrarian, had in Greece chosen to have a cleanly shaved head for the eastward journey, and sported a fine Fu Manchu moustache. My hair was growing in, but I must have looked rather exotic or just plain weird to these children. The crowd around me was a pulsating ocean of the most beautiful children I had ever seen, for Afghanistan is a repository of all the genes of all the world, from conquerors to traders, on camel, on horse, on foot, from China and Spain for the last 1,000 years. All who had passed through this tragic land had either been beaten back or absorbed by the populations on this, the greatest of all caravan routes. This child gene pool of the world swarmed me, laughing and screeching, and trying to prod me, and when I made a good-natured move toward them, they recoiled en masse, like a field of wheat in the wind. A well-intentioned man came along and chased them away, spoiling our fun. Some of the little girls looked quite European, with straight auburn hair. Some had the green eyes I had seen on the lone woman from the bus. I wondered where her eyes had come from. Were these eyes from one of Marco Polo's men on his way to China? Were they eyes left generations ago by a passing warrior in the service of Kublai Khan? These people probably knew little of their violent and hellish history. The victims of endless enthusiastic conquerors, these people were once Christian, then Buddhist, and now Muslim. I am sure they would prefer to be left alone. Toward sunset, we piled into the bus again. From outside I watched the mystery woman take her seat, and intentionally, waited a moment before entering the vehicle so that she might get herself settled and I could steal a good look at her as I passed. As I moved up the aisle, she looked straight ahead as if frozen, and I took my seat behind her. But I did see those brilliant green eyes in the failing sunset. I sat admiring her burqa and the way she sat and swayed sideways with the bus. She sat, for the most part, upright and with dignity. I noticed her head turn slightly as if about to speak to me, but it was momentary and incomplete. She stared out the side window for the longest time, though. Perhaps she felt my gaze and was about to ask me to stop looking at the back of her head. For some reason I thought that she might be 20 or 25 years old with a trim figure. We drove for a couple of hours and about 9 p.m. stopped in the middle of nowhere, and the driver turned off the engine. There was a silence in the bus that was like the end of the world. It was so dark. It would have been pitch dark except for the most brilliant full moon tracking over the mountains in the distance and the illumination of hundreds of puddles of water, as if someone had cast down thousands of pieces of broken mirror over the vastness of this empty, rain-soaked land. It was then that I noticed that the woman had started to subtly scan the horizon. Suddenly she stopped and fixed her glare in the distance to the left of the bus. I saw nothing, but from the way she peered, it was obvious that she did. Moments later, I was able to make out a movement over the saucer-shaped puddles in the distance, and a clear figure started to emerge from the darkness. It appeared to be someone on horseback galloping towards us at speed. The woman stood up, and while collecting her belongings did not glance at me, although I was just a few inches from her. In the desert silence we could now hear the approach of horse-hoof thumps, marking the hurried mission of the rider. He came to a stop perhaps 30 feet from the bus, and dead silence fell over the land once again. Horse and rider stood motionless as one, a blackened shadow, the only animation being vast clouds of mist billowing from the horse's nostrils. The door to the bus opened, and the woman moved toward the exit, but when on the first step hesitated for a moment and looked back, I was quite sure, despite the darkness, directly at me. She had patiently waited all day to steal a glance at this strange young foreigner from far away, and it was a glance that turned into a pause that lasted longer than was necessary for practical purposes. She hesitated a moment, turned, and headed back towards me, or so I thought. She reached into her bag and pulled something out, and in the darkness placed an object on the seat that she had occupied on the journey. She glanced up at me. Her eyes widened, and in an instant turned and again headed for the exit. All eyes followed her as she skirted the icy silver pools bathed in moonlight. When she reached the rider, he extended a hand, and with one silky motion pulled her aloft and deposited her snugly behind him on the saddled horse. She wrapped one arm around his waist and clutched her cloth sack with the other. There seemed no exchange of words. The man looked over his shoulder at her for a moment, as if examining her. His gaze turned to the bus and fixed on us as a whole, but I was sure he was looking straight at me. I fear I recoiled a bit, for no logical reason, since all this was happening in moonlight, and there's no way he could have known that I had looked into his woman's eyes and entertained romantic thoughts. A moment later he kicked the horse in the loins, making it rear up, and off they tore into the vast darkness of the Afghan desert. All eyes were on this pair as I reached over the seat and picked up the object the woman had left. I was sure she had left it for me, judging by the look she gave. It was an object heavy and flat, cold and warm to the touch at the same time. I took out my little flashlight and examined the gift, and to my surprise it was an antique pouch made from many layers of leather and decorated by hand-forged steel plates of a most intricate design. I have parted with many things in my life, but have kept that pouch all these years, and occasionally thought of the woman with the green eyes and wondered if there were, somewhere in the wilds of that amazing country, beautiful children bearing those same eyes entrancing other travelers.